how would a great sage deal with the objects of the world? Would they consider some acceptable and some unacceptable? How would they deal in general with what they see in the world, and what place do they abide in? Now, in relation to this, I'll speak about a verse from the Ashtavakra Gita. And so if you're new to the channel, the Ashtavakra Gita is what is known as a nididhyasana text, a text that you come across on the cusp of enlightenment or beyond enlightenment. And this is one of the higher teachings within Sanatana Dharma. And so this verse today that I'm going to speak to you about from the Ashtavakra Gita is about how a sage sees the world and whether they find things that they perceive as acceptable or unacceptable. Let me read this important verse to you. Why should that steady-minded one who knows the object of perception to be in its very nature nothing, consider one thing acceptable and another unacceptable? So in this verse, when we're talking about objects of perception, we're talking about both internal and external, right? So when you hear sages and that talk about objects of perception, a lot of people just think it's the objects in the world. But part of the teaching is, and probably the main part of the teaching, are the objects of perception we have within ourselves, right? So the way that we see the world according to the conditioning and the socialization process that we've endured, these are objects of perception as well, right? There's something that you operate through. They have a function. But Ashtavakra is saying here that all objects are in essence nothing. Now, we often cling to the objects of perception, right? No matter whether it's external, but we more so cling to our own conditioning and our own perception of the world, so the internal landscape. So we find it really hard to let go of that, right? But Ashtavakra is stating here that no matter whether you think it is real or not, in essence, an object is nothing. And so if it is essentially nothing, it operates from a place of nothingness, it is just something that is in the field of awareness, then why would we find some things acceptable and unacceptable? Now, this is the question that Ashtavakra is posing to us, right? And so from the ultimate state, right, Atman, the undifferentiated consciousness, is all that exists. And it is identical with Brahman, the ultimate reality. So if that is all that exists, how could we find anything acceptable or unacceptable from that ultimate place? Obviously, from the place of the jiva, the ego persona system, we can find things acceptable or unacceptable, right? So some may enjoy pizza as opposed to vegetables. But we're not kind of talking on that very frivolous level, right? This is just on the superficial level. We're talking more about the deeper ideological realm, right? The deeper realm where people get triggered from, right? So their ego persona system. If you said to someone that you don't like pizza, but that person really likes pizza, I'm pretty sure the other person would remain aloof. You know, they don't care if you like pizza or not. They like pizza, right? So the problem is on the ideological realm, so the belief systems, the conditioning we've endured. We try to hold on to these and we defend these, and we don't realize that in their nature they are nothing. So everything in the world from the sage's perspective is completely non-existent, right? It's a superimposition on the Atman, right? So we've accumulated all of these things in our lives that we think are real, and this kind of encases the Atman, the undifferentiated consciousness, and we operate from a differentiated state of consciousness, and we think that is what is real, this differentiated state of consciousness that we're perceiving the world through, that we're attached to. But the sage is saying, no, this is not true at all. This is only a superimposition on the fundamental reality. And the irony is that when we operate from that dualistic ego perception, we superimpose that onto the world around us, which also is purely Brahman, right? So we superimpose our version of the world onto the world so it suits our own egotistical, dualistic mind. But nothing could be more of a cognitive error than that, and a fundamental illusion, right? That's what it really is. So the sage essentially is unattached to the objects of the world and the objects within themselves, so to speak, right? So from their perspective, they probably don't have much left within themselves because they're operating from the undifferentiated state of consciousness, but they're not attached to anything. And because they're not attached to anything, they don't have an idea of what is acceptable and unacceptable. That only comes from when you are attached to a certain dualistic perception, right? And you operate from that dualistic mind. Then you have ideas of right and wrong, good and bad, and so forth and so on. But the sage does not have that. The sage does not operate from that place. They operate from pure, undifferentiated consciousness. And so they don't hanker after those objects that give pleasure and at the same time avoid those that give pain. They don't operate from that dualistic perception. They allow the world to arise as it is, as Brahman alone, because that's all that truly exists. And that's the state of consciousness the sage abides in, right? They've finally understood the great Mahavakya, Aham Brahmasmi. I am Brahman without the I. And so they operate from that undifferentiated state that Brahman alone is real. And so no object could ever touch them. Now that's the role for all of us spiritual aspirants on the path, to get out of these objects of perceptions, both in the internal realm and the external realm. But it's primary to deal on the internal realm because that'll have an effect on how you perceive your external objects of perception, right? You're starting to work on the inner layer. You're starting to thin away the jiva, the ego persona system. You're starting to thin that away. So then finally you can realize as the sage that truly your nature as Atman is identical with the ultimate truth of Brahman. Shanti, shanti, shanti.